Risien. I'm at Oregon State University. I'm with ARIS. I'm so happy to see so many of you today. This is a workshop session, so there's going to be lots of engagement. We're going to use a few tools, and I just want to kind of do a quick check-in with everybody. As a start, if you're Zoom, if you can go up into the upper right corner and look for the view button and make sure you're in gallery view so you can see each other's faces. That would be great. If this is available to you and you are comfortable with it, camera's on. And if not, that's okay. And we're going to be using reactions. So if you aren't used to using reactions on Zoom, if you go down to the bottom of your gallery view screen, all the way to the right, you should see a little smiley face, reactions. And there's some quickly available ones. It's not really going to matter which ones you use, so you can just pick any of those. And I'm going to give you a start. So using a reaction, let me know if you are familiar with Jamboards. All right. So a handful, it looks like a handful of people not familiar. Dennis, is that your chosen reaction or is that your I am not familiar?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it. I'm sorry.
Okay, good to know. Okay, so I'm going to at some point put you in some random breakout rooms. So hopefully it looks like we have critical mass of people who've used Jamboards. You can help each other, but I'll give you a little intro to that as well. All right, and let's see. One other thing, we're going to use a Qualtrics survey, which should be a pretty straightforward thing to do. So I'm going to just quickly share my screen. I should let you know I only have 4 slides. I'm not going to spend a lot of time sharing screen, but I do want to just make sure that I give you a few visuals to start with. So first of all, this is just one to remind me that the tools for customizing broader impacts infrastructure design are ones that are empirically based off of some research that I've done with NABI, ARIS, and the Broader Impacts Design Project, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Again, I'm Julie Risien from Oregon State University. My key collaborators on the development and situation of these tools based on and kind of the collection of the data that we used for them are Kelly Hoke from Oregon State University, and then a key collaborator in kind of contextualizing these tools for use within an institution is Tiffany Fleming from Cornell University, neither of which are able to be with us today. So that's my quick screen share just to let you know that the work that that I'm presenting on is, like I said, based on the Broader Impacts Design Project funded by NSF. I have one more screen to share with you. All right, so you may have seen the poster presented by Eve Klein and others. There's a handful of people on this call who are familiar with the Broader Impacts Design Project. But this poster, Telling Our Stories, Partnerships to Support Broader Impacts Capacity, kind of summarizes what we've done with that project. It is coming to a close, but it's available in the attendee hub if you're interested to learn more about broader impacts design. It was funded by the NSF, as is ARIS and NABI, where some of the data came from as well. And it was the research and contextualization part was done in collaboration with Oregon State University and Institute for Learning Innovation, and many other institutions were involved, some of them represented in this call here today. So what I want to focus on is just some conceptual and thinking tools. And we're only going to have a little bit of opportunity to explore and practice with them. But the goal is to think through establishing, assessing, framing, and reframing broader impacts infrastructure to meet the unique needs of an individual institution. And also to meet the context of the moment, right? So this is a very dynamic space. Many of us are working in complex organizations, and we kind of need to stay ahead of it. And there is a tendency to build something and then shift your primary focus of work to sustaining that thing or growing that thing. And I really want to encourage people to think about broader impacts infrastructure in the dynamic context where it exists, where the national priorities are changing. Our talk that some of you probably were at the keynote with or when we heard a lot of things that are things that we wouldn't have necessarily anticipated hearing 12 or 15 years ago about broader impacts. So the kinds of infrastructure that's needed to support calls for the TIP directorate is very different than what was needed just to have good broader impacts plans on individual projects, which is where many of us started this work. So that's what I really want to press today, is that the system is complex and it's dynamic. I want to use reactions really quickly here to figure out if, I'm going to make my screen a little bit bigger. If you can let me know, there's four categories I'm going to give, and then we just use reactions, and I'll ask you to put up and then take them down. That's one thing about reactions, is they hang out for a while if you don't take them down. The four categories are you an administrator, a broader impacts professional, a bit of both, or neither? That's what I'm going to ask you. So those are the four categories. So if you are an administrator, go ahead and give me a reaction. For those of you who are in here or just joining, gallery view is helpful for this. And I have at least 2 pages of gallery view, so you may need to flip back and forth. So if you're an administrator, give me a thumbs up. Okay, I'm just seeing about 4 or 5 administrators. All right, now go ahead and take those down. If you identify yourself very bravely as an administrator in this group, I guess. If you're a broader impacts professional / squeaky wheel / guerrilla operative, go ahead and give me a thumbs up or other reaction of your choice. All right, so everyone can scroll and sort of see who we're working with. There's a lot of broader impacts professionals. How about if you're a bit of both? So take yours down if you were broader impacts professional, bit of both. All right. Oh, well, I'm a bit of both too. All right, take those down. What about neither? You're none of these things. All right. Okay, so feel free to unmute. For those of you who said you're none of these things, where are you situated? How would you identify your role in relation to this community? Or you can throw it in the chat too. I think I saw Kelsey. I'm thinking she would say research development.
Yeah,
others?
I would say research development, and I'm a project manager right now, but looking for a space to do broader impacts within research development.
Great. Partner, I see in the chat. Anyone else? All right.
I picked other, Julie. And I don't know, and then I don't know how to describe my identity. I think, so I am helping people set up infrastructure, but mostly with a focus on evaluation and research metrics.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, that's, Karen, you bring up a good point, which I think a lot of people in this community are in boundary spaces. We are boundary professionals of some sort, which is what makes us great at this kind of work. All right, so I said we were going to talk about BI infrastructure tools. And so I want to just give a definition. I'll just verbally read this to you. So broader impacts infrastructure, at least for the purposes of this conversation, is the intentional configuration of an organization or unit with the goal of advancing societal impacts of research. These units, programs, or initiatives exist in a complex system of people, structures, practices, and partnerships. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about infrastructure. And it may be infrastructure that emerges specifically for the purpose of creating something new to address a new challenge that the funding agencies are putting forward to us, or to address a moral imperative or value of a strategic plan of an institution. Or it may be something that emerges out of existing capacities, right? That's sort of some reframing that's done to create a broader impacts unit. Some of you have been involved in the ORIC program, and you may have other ways of looking at this as well. Hopefully this will complement the needs assessment and work that's done in ORIC. All right, so I want to do one more use of reactions. I'm going to ask you what your status is. So if you're not at an institute of higher ed or a big organization that's supporting broader impacts, you can opt out or you can make your best guess. But here are the three options. We, whatever your organization is, have BI infrastructure and it's going great. We have BI infrastructure that exists, but we need to rethink it or revive it. Or we're trying to develop broader impacts infrastructure. So we're going to go one at a time, and then I guess the last one will be none of the above. So we have BI infrastructure and it's going great. Go ahead and give us a reaction. Oh no, this can't be good. Oh, okay, that's good news. Leah's at my institution, so that seems like good news for me. Oh, Diane from Iowa State says it's going great. Okay, well, if it's going great, you don't need us anyway. So, but I love to spend time with you. Okay, we have BI infrastructure that exists, but we need to rethink it or reframe it. You can pick any reaction you feel is appropriate. All right. Okay, a little bit more. Great. And I'm just kind of flipping back and forth as people find their reaction tools. Okay, go ahead and take those down. The third one is we are trying to develop broader impacts infrastructure. All right, looks like a handful of those. All right. Would anybody say none of the above? Right. All right. Okay. So I think we're all in the right place. That's good. A couple none of the aboves. Feel free to ask questions and chime in however you see fit. Sometimes those external perspectives are really helpful too. All right, so again, I said that this work was empirical. It was based on the project of broader impacts design, which I'll give you a little premise if you didn't see the poster or haven't seen us present at previous ARIS summits. But the broader impacts design project took 9 institutions of higher ed and 10 or 11 institutions that were focused on informal public engagement, right? So museums and science centers. And the project studied partnerships between those two types of organizations. And as part of that, we really had to interrogate the infrastructure at each type of organization. So that work has resulted in 2 book chapters. And I've been told I've been allowed to tease the Broader Impacts Handbook, which is expected out next year. And 1 book chapter is about the role of informal science learning organizations such as museums and science centers. And the other one is about broader impacts infrastructure. And so that's what I'm going to share with you today. I see a lot going on in the chat. Jory, feel free to chime in if I'm not sure I can track all that and all of everything else. So the chapter is about, it really presents 5 lessons from the data and also by telling some stories, capturing each of those. And those are in order to develop broader impacts infrastructure or to reframe it, embracing complexity is key. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit in this next bit of time. Engaging stakeholders through what we called strategic net weaving is really important. We're not going to talk about that, but there are tons of people with expertise in that space in this community, and hopefully you're getting some of that. And then considering all the variables. So we're going to talk about 5 kind of continuums of key aspects of broader impacts infrastructure to think through as you are developing, reframing, or assessing. And then we talk a lot about partnerships and the practices of people who broker and engage in partnerships. We're not going to talk about that today, but ARIS has a lot of tools around partnership that are very useful. And just the idea of employing adaptive practices and adaptive management, which I suspect we're not necessarily going to get to today. So let me do, I think, one more slide share. All right, so in terms of, sorry, I have a lot of things. I tried to be really engaged, but that means I have a lot of things going on my screen at the same time. I'm going to share my screen for a bit. All right, so in terms of embracing complexity, we kind of put forward some really important things. One, that networking and collaborative mindsets are critical. Two is that connections inside and also outside of an institution need to be explored. And that new infrastructure can bolster the broader impacts work, but it can also threaten the work that others are already doing. And that's something to be really careful about in developing infrastructure, is that reaction of people feeling that their work is being undervalued or threatened because something new is coming online. And while complexity is a challenge, it can also be, if you really have a lot of awareness and kind of lean into the known complexity and try to see it for all that it is, it can also be a source of resilience, which is really important. So I find something really helpful that's used in higher education change quite a bit, especially in pedagogical reform spaces, is this reframing organizations and the Bowman and Deal's 4 frames. It's originally a model that came about in the 90s, and it's been sort of reiterated in 2017. This book came out, and it's particularly helpful for understanding the uniqueness and complexity of each higher education institution. So it uses these 4 lenses through which to look at your organization. They're structural, human resources, political, and symbolic, which I often will call cultural. So they suggest that problem solving and management, when people just sort of approach it wholesale, fails because it doesn't sort of disaggregate the organization enough to see it clearly. And see how these different aspects interact with each other, and to understand whenever you're navigating, building something new or creating something where or reframing something, that you are often working with one of these lenses at a time, but that doesn't mean that it's not interacting with all of the others. So the idea here is to think about how your organization is qualitatively complex, and it's part of a landscape that has many overlapping systems. And for us, broader impacts, I would say, is one of the systems, right? Education and learning is a system, research is a system. I think you can sort of parse that out in lots of different ways. So the symbolic frame is one that's talking about culture. Sometimes that's driven by something like a land grant directive or a special institutional identity. For instance, like an HBCU will often have a lot of symbolic or cultural elements that are woven through the institution. Human resources is about capacities and relationships, and the connection between people. And so in this case, all the BI champions and where they sit are human resources. Political is about power and positioning, and sometimes I would say posturing too. Who do you have to advocate for? Where do the resources come from, and how do those decisions get made? And the structural is about the social architecture of an organization, and how sort of distributed that might be. So I'm going to stop sharing screen, and we're going to go into some breakout rooms. Before we do, I want to, and I'll float around between them. I want to give you a couple of directions. The breakout rooms are going to occur in a Jamboard. I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat right now. Oops. All right, so you'll all be using the Jamboard once you get into the breakout room. I'm going to assign you randomly because there's just too many of you to do it any other way. And each breakout room is going to address one of these frames, right? And the directions are to just take 1 to 2 minutes to read a little bit more about the frame, and you can sort of discuss it among your group. And then I put 3 questions around each frame. These are just example questions, the kinds of things you might ask yourself to use the 4 frames as a kind of interrogating tool with a team that's working on broader impacts infrastructure. And there are sticky notes. So for those of you who've used Jamboard, help those of those in the group who haven't. I have pre-populated with sticky notes. Some of them they all have just a period on them because it won't let you make a sticky note with no text. And if you double click on any of those sticky notes, you can type your notes in. There's also stars off to the right. You can drag and drop those stars onto someone else's sticky note to provide emphasis to it. And you can add new sticky notes, you can group them together, you can put them on top of each other. There's lots of things you can do. So my directions are take a couple minutes to read through the description and discuss it. Take one question at a time and discuss it in the group and add some of your answers. And anybody can do that. And then use the stars to add emphasis. When you report back, I'm going to ask you what stood out about working with that frame. And do you feel anything is over or under, do you feel that that frame is over or under emphasized in your own explorations at your institution, and why? I'll put those in the chat as well. I'm going to put the directions and everything in the chat. But first, I'm going to see, I want to ask if there are questions, but there's a lot of you. I think we could get bogged down in the logistics. So here's what I'm going to ask you instead. I'm going to pop into each group. I'm going to ask you to lean into the ambiguity of breakout room directions, knowing that there's always some, what are we supposed to do? Why are we doing this? And just help each other out there. If there's any burning questions, you can come back into the main room and check out with me. I'm going to give you guys 10 minutes. All right, ready, set, go. Thank you all for what I'm sure was a lot of patience and grace with ambiguity going into that room. That was really just an introduction. What I'd like to do fairly quickly here, and we can just, if your room, you probably didn't have time to sort of designate someone or report out, but I've got these questions in here about if anything stood out about the frame you were using. So I'm going to go ahead and just ask sort of for a popcorn response. If people have insights, things that stood out to them that they hadn't thought about before, just let us know your frame and what that thing was. And we'll do that one first. We'll just take a couple minutes to do that. So anything stand out about the human resources frame? Anybody in that group? Something they hadn't considered in infrastructure? And this is either verbal or in the chat's fine.
The pre-college programs as an asset.
Great, great. That is true at my university as well. All right, what about the political frame? Anybody in that group? Anything stand out?
I think there was a lot of shared kind of positioning as in the guerrilla space, which is there's not a lot of recognition or support, you know, that people are fighting and struggling to get the recognition and support they need to do the work, or to have the work acknowledged. I don't know, the rest of the people in my group, is that accurate?
I see lots of nodding.
Yeah.
It resonates with me as well. I used to say I got a lot of pats on the back and lots of time on the podium, but no, not a lot of resources to do the work.
Yeah.
All right. What about the symbolic and cultural frame? Anything stand out to that group?
When we first tried to unpack what we were trying to define there, our initial, I don't know if I'm entirely speaking for the group, but our institutions tended to be siloed as opposed to already integrated. And so culturally, maybe that symbolic or cultural lens might create some negative post-it notes that we need to try and overcome. But then within that, there might be some things like, oops, now I've lost it. An emerging, one of our members was an emerging HSI and focused on supporting that heritage and providing scholarships for affected families. And that we're a research institution and a land grant institution. It goes across all of our silos. So it brings us
that those kinds of things do come up, and sometimes negative things. Like I'll tell you, at my institution, I don't think this is true now, but when I first started this work, this is not my job. I would say it was a cultural story we told ourselves. pretty ubiquitously, especially in certain disciplines. And that's changed. So the nice thing about exploring the cultural frame is also being able to reflect on how it changes over time. So one thing I'm not going to dig into the report out much more because I do want to move on. And I loved the chance to sort of dig in a little bit. And I'm of course teasing a chapter in this book, so these tools will be published there. But the idea here is to make sure that there's not a lot of imbalance. And sometimes when we're planning something, we might just really be focused on the political maneuvering without understanding, well, what are the assets that we're bringing to bear that might not be in the political conversation, for example. So that's really why I find that tool helpful. Okay, the next thing that we're going to talk about is situating infrastructure in the context of the uniqueness of your institution based on these 5 empirically derived sort of continuums. And I'm going to skip the slide sharing because it's getting a little complicated. But actually, yeah, I'll share something else. What these are, let's see, they're about, sorry. All right, just going to share this right here. So these 5 continuums are you seeing a Word document or a PowerPoint document?
We are seeing, it looks like a Word document.
Okay, great. Okay. These 5 continuums are things that people often talk about and kind of struggle with. And I heard some of it in the conversation before. And so some of them are going to be just institutional realities to sort of be aware of and grapple with. Others represent a decision point, a place where you can say, we have some flexibility here. Where do we want to sit? What kinds of capacities do we have to prepare us to do different kinds of things? And so, the organizational structure is your organization very centralized or decentralized, and therefore is your broader impacts infrastructure, a unit or program or initiative, is that going to be very decentralized or centralized? The orientation of support, are you providing service to individuals or project teams to help them meet their goals and missions, or are you recruiting them and bringing them into a unit level mission and having them orient their broader impacts around the unit's mission? So it's kind of 2 sides of the spectrum. The role of broader impacts, are you actually designing, delivering, evaluating broader impacts? Or are you brokering the relationships, connections, ideas, scholarship, and things that others need to do that? On the scale of engagement, working with individuals or small teams, or are you limited to working with centers and institutes and, I don't get out of bed for anything less than a $10 million grant kind of service, which many broader impacts infrastructure are sort of structured in that way to help the large scale work. And then the source of funding. Is your source of funding, kind of pieced together extramural grants and contracts, or is it an internal investment from your institution? So these are fake institutions. So they're amalgamated institutions that we've sort of placed on here, right? So the one with the square is, a research development office under a vice chancellor for research. They help PIs find their partners and evaluators. So they're doing a lot of brokerage and service work. Their funding is internal, and they're working kind of at all scales based on kind of an as needed basis. So that's just an example. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. We are so short on time. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share with you a survey, and I'm going to ask that you take 5 minutes to skim through and place your own broader impacts infrastructure on the survey. So the 2 things to think about are, is this a decision I get to make in designing broader impacts infrastructure, or is this an institutional reality I need to be aware of? There are quite long, lengthy descriptions underneath those, and they also talk about the consequences. But keep in mind that anything on either edge of a continuum like that is going to create a lot of strength in terms of identifying who the organization is and what it does and what it doesn't do, but it's also going to create a lot of rigidity and sort of take away nimbleness and flexibility to be fluid based on funding resources, right? So, and some of these things go together. And then in the middle, you get that fluidity, but it's actually at the cost of ambiguity and having a difficult time sort of saying what you are and what you aren't, and building out the capacity that's needed for that. So I see some people might drop off. Go ahead, and I'm going to shut down my camera. I'm just going to put a timer on for myself for 5 minutes to have everybody kind of go through that. It is a skim situation. At the end of the survey, it will generate a summary of your responses, which I believe you could sort of PDF print or do something if you wanted to capture it for future. So this is a tool that I only this week thought this would be interesting to do as a survey and a way to explore if you were working with a team or a group of sort of people who are advocates and champions for your broader impacts work, maybe explore what they think about which things are flexible and not flexible, and what's appropriate work. I think what we hear in the community is we are all doing this boundary work, and it's unclear sometimes who is just supporting and kind of working in like more of a meta space, building the scaffolding around broader impacts, and who's actually doing the broader impacts and evaluating broader impacts work. And some people are doing both. I do both. And that can be very confusing. It can also be very difficult to claim successes with brokering work, for instance. So like if your work is brokering and your funding is extramural, you might have a problem, right? And so you might have to think about, is the work the right work? Is the source of funding the only option? Those kinds of things. So I am thinking about if it's useful to some of you, I'm happy to kind of remove some of the typos from that and share that tool. Jory and I are thinking about, we might be able to use it for the organizational infrastructure development project as well. Okay, I see a thumbs up. All right. So I wanted to, did anything come up? Any people, I did ask you a couple kind of reflective questions at the end that could help me improve that so it could be more useful for others. You still have access to that survey. You could take it, you could send it to other people. It's all, I don't have any way to identify anyone. So other than getting a summary of your results, I am interested to see the variety of things that people put in there, but not using it for any kind of empirical work. Any reflections or comments on that as a tool?
I like the slider scale. I want to use that for other things. I didn't realize you could do that in Qualtrics to kind of orient yourself on a spectrum.
Yeah, quick tip. I used Qualtrics to do that because it's actually accessible. There's a lot of other ways you can do sliders, but it's not accessible for blind, visually impaired folks. All right, well, we don't actually have a lot of time left. So I think I underestimated the time taken by mechanics. I had wanted you to do that working group so you could discuss. I wanted to just put out one last tool, and I'll quickly share a screen to do that. So another way to do this, of course, is just on paper with these kind of, sliders and having people show them. But the final thing I wanted to address was just how dynamic the system is. And I started with this point. But of course, there is a tendency to build some sort of infrastructure and then shift your energy, not necessarily consciously, but subconsciously often, to prioritizing its sustainability and growth. And I think that is sometimes the death of broader impacts offices that pop up and then quickly dissolve. And that's really unfortunate. And I know that I spent a lot of time kind of fighting for resources for something, and ultimately had to decide to actively shut it down to make space for other things, other efforts that would support broader impacts and possibly be better at getting resources, especially institutional resources, to do the work. I had that condition that I shared where I had external funding, yet with an internal focus on the service. So I was doing brokerage work when I had external funding, and those two things did not match up very well. And then, these efforts to create broader impacts infrastructure, they can be really productive in advancing impacts, whether or not it's experimental, ephemeral, it's just sort of a short-term initiative. If some efforts really just go for, let's just create a lot of relationships and shared understanding about the position of broader impacts in our institution. But because they change out over time, we need to regularly assess them. So this is a super simplified adaptive management diagram, basically, and any point is an entry point. And I'm going to use an example. So in the assessment place, you might want to, for instance, revisit the 4 frames. So say you have to do annual reporting for your unit, or you have a 5-year review, which is the way my unit is reviewed. This is a good time to step back into those 4 frames and say, are we attending to the symbolic, the human assets, the political, and the structural dynamics of our institution? Have things changed? The design or redesign, situate or resituate, and innovate is also a great thing to look at those 5 continuums again. Are these things that were institutional realities when we envisioned this thing still institutional realities, or are they now changeable? Is our funding and our activity matched up? Is our scale and our capacity matched up? Those kinds of things. And then observing and adapting to change. So an example here is for instance, if there's a large national scale development, like, I don't know, say a new directorate that's really interested in impacts, this might be an opportunity to observe and then understand your organization within that new context. And this is where you can really rely on ARIS, because we are doing this constant observing and sharing out work. So ARIS is a great resource. And if you're not finding what you need from the resources that are out there and accessible, you can reach out to any of us. I know for Jory and I, that's true. You can reach out and say, hey, do you know what's going on? And we will always we'll always prioritize sharing. So this cycle, it has rhythm and logic, but you can really enter at any point, and there's no prescription for it. If you notice a big change, go for the observe and considering how you should adapt. If you notice, for instance, some universities experience some collective trauma, like something terrible happens at their university and a president gets fired and things get restructured, those are times to assess the conditions, to revisit those 4 frames and understand, are you still serving the institution in all its uniqueness? So I'm going to stop that share, and I'm going to just kind of close out with some organizational philosophy, which Jory and Diane know I like to dabble in super nerd philosophy, and some organizational philosophers that have really informed some of my research. They talk about something called organizational becoming, and that is this idea that organizations are constantly coming to be what they are in the moment based on the cultural histories and activities of the past. And in each moment, they're presenting a new iteration of themselves that has never before been experienced. And I think those are the types of open eyes we need to have when we're doing this work. So in other words, just change is the only real constant. And the act of organizing and creating any kind of level of bureaucracy or organization around broader impacts or around anything is really just the act of slowing the change down enough that we can see it clearly and we can understand it. And that is really what broader impacts infrastructure is trying to do, is let's get the lay of the land, let's slow things down enough that we can understand how we can influence it, how we can really work to advance impacts. So it's, I think, just hubris, right, to think that we can control change. And that is a really nice thing to let go of when you get to that point. But with some humility and really embracing complexity, we can do this. We can make real change and transformation. And that's what I hope that you get out of today, that infrastructure for infrastructure's sake is not what any of us are after. All of us are after impact. And that is one of the greatest things about this community, is that there is a shared moral imperative of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And it's one of the things that makes this a really collaborative community. So I see in the chat, some people are reaching out to each other, which is fantastic. And I would certainly encourage you to do that. I'm done with my soapbox and pontification. I'm going to stay here for a while and I'm happy to take any questions or final comments.